Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Phil Ponce.
And I'm Amanda Vinicky. Phil, it's nice to have you back tonight as Brandis Friedman and Paris Schutz have the evening off. On the show,
we're not in the danger zone, in part because there is a lot of vaccinations that are out there.
Lollapalooza starts Thursday as COVID cases spike in Chicago and nationally. We asked Chicago's top doctor if the festival should be canceled.
Wildfires raging across the West cast a smoky haze visible across the country, including here in Chicago. Will an extended fire season become the new norm?
On the 31st anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, President Biden introduces protections for long COVID symptoms.
Rush Medical Center is requiring all workers to be vaccinated against COVID-19. That and more from Cranes.
Looking at poverty's role in the child welfare system in a new brief from the University of Chicago.
Women are the fastest growing incarcerated group in the country. We talk with formerly incarcerated women and also with community leaders about the system's impact.
I'm Angelito, and coming up tonight, we've got dance lessons with Lippies and Stallions.
But first, some of today's top stories. Another violent weekend in Chicago. In all, 70 people were shot, including 12 fatally, according to Chicago police. Of the 52 separate shooting incidents, there were 2 shootings by police Sunday, one off-duty, one on, that left one person wounded. Police Superintendent David Brown continued to lay blame on the courts. Take a look.
Can the courts hold people in jail who are violent, who have been arrested, who have been charged with murder? Murder. I don't think there's another city in this country releasing people charged with murder back into the community on electronic monitoring.
Meanwhile, the Chicago Police Union is one step closer to a new contract. Ballots are being mailed today to thousands of active and retired rank-and-file police officers for an up or down vote on a proposal that could lead to a contract. In a YouTube video, the president of Fraternal Order of Police Lodge 7, John Catanzara, urged members to participate.
Please vote. I cannot stress the importance of voting in this time of just such an anti-police climate. We need to send a message not only to City Hall, but the City Council, who will still have to ratify this, even if the membership says yes.
If approved, this would be the first contract in 4 years after bitter negotiations, ending the longest-running union negotiations in Chicago history. The contract would lift a ban that has prohibited anonymous complaints about police misconduct and provides police with more mental health supports.
I am pleased that we finally got it done. It shouldn't have taken this long. I shouldn't have walked into office with a contract that was already 2 years expired. It shouldn't have taken us 2 more years to get it done, because we had an FOP leadership that was literally refusing to get to the table. And I told them over and over again, we're not going to talk about money unless we talk about accountability.
Chicago's Lollapalooza is on schedule to open in spite of the spike in COVID cases. The setup in Grant Park was gearing up today as the mayor told reporters she has no second thoughts about the multi-day music festival. Lollapalooza starts Thursday and crowds of more than 100,000 fans per day are expected. You'll need proof of vaccination to get in, but if you are unvaccinated, there are conflicting guidelines right now. You'll need proof of a negative COVID test. The mayor says it's a 48-hour negative testing window, but the Lolla website says 72 hours. And now to Phil Ponce and more Lollapalooza and COVID cases in a conversation with Chicago's top doctor. Phil.
Amanda, COVID-19 cases are once again skyrocketing across the country, and Chicago has not been immune. The city is now averaging 165 daily cases. That's a 76% increase since just last week. The case positivity rate also continues to grow, while about 52% of all Chicagoans have now been fully vaccinated. This as Lollapalooza begins Thursday. The 4-day music festival is expected to draw hundreds of thousands of people to Grant Park, and the worry is that it could become a super spreader event. Joining us now with more is Dr. Allison Arwady, Commissioner of Chicago's Department of Public Health. Dr. Arwady, thank you so much for joining us. And as we just mentioned, the cases continue to climb, and there's widespread confusion right now as to whether or not people should be wearing masks. Should people be wearing masks indoors when they go to stores, when they go to shopping for food and drugstores and so forth?
Yeah, so at this point, anybody who is not vaccinated should be wearing a mask inside all over Chicago and really all over the U.S. If folks are vaccinated, we are not at this point recommending that people routinely need to wear masks. But certainly, if you're concerned, if you've got someone at home that you're worried about, I would encourage folks to think about putting a mask on if it's not bothering you that much to wear it. We still are seeing the huge majority of cases, and then especially hospitalizations and deaths occurring in people who are not vaccinated. But as you know, cases are on the increase everywhere. And if we get to a point where we need to make that recommendation for really all Chicagoans to go back to the mask, we'll do that.
And personal question, what are you doing when you go out and about, when you go inside a store, when you go shopping and so forth?
Yeah, so I definitely default to having my mask on. I keep it on whenever I'm going into a new setting, partly because I want to see what's happening in that setting. And then generally, if I'm my mask doesn't bother me, I'll be honest with you. Particularly, I'm very used to it at this point. I also know that people will recognize me and might be interested in whether or not I am wearing that mask. But certainly, if I'm in a setting that's smaller, I ask, is everybody vaccinated? If everybody's vaccinated, we take our masks off.
As we mentioned, Lollapalooza opens on Thursday, and 100,000 people a day are going to be expected at Grant Park. I know the city's been fine with the festival going forward. Is that the smart thing to do, given the rising cases?
So I'll tell you, when you look at what can we do to make a setting as safe as possible, Lollapalooza really has tried to do that. First and foremost, it's out of doors. And I know there's a lot of focus on Lolla because it's downtown, but we actually have had a lot of outdoor gatherings where you're thinking about the various parades and parties and festivals that are back. So out of doors is important. And Lolla, in this case, really said, yeah, we're going to do this the right way. We're going to make sure folks are either vaccinated or they've had that negative test. And then they've done a lot behind the scenes around making sure, where there are indoor spaces, that they're working on the air handling there, that they're making sure staff are getting tested and vaccinated. So there's no setting that's without risk. But I do think that in this case, we've done everything that's in our power to make this as safe as possible. And if folks are coming and they're vaccinated and or have had that recent negative test, the risk is not zero. But I do think for an outdoor setting, it's controlled.
We just saw a video, as you were speaking, of past Lollapaloozas, and you see people moshing together, people passing bodies across the crowd and that sort of thing. Really, you're okay with that?
So, we have to make these decisions based on what we know about risk settings. And we've seen, there were a number of big studies that looked at these kinds of outdoor gatherings. And generally speaking, they've not been seen to have increased risk. We were concerned about a music festival in Norway that happened about a month ago that had quite a bit of spread. We learned in that case they were allowing people to get vaccinated and then walk right into the festival. We know that is not protective. The vaccine is not immediately protective, right? It takes a number of weeks, that second dose, et cetera. And so we really have tried to look and see what can we do to make things as safe as possible. Do I wish we were still where we were a month ago? Sure. Am I very glad that we're not Arkansas or Louisiana or some of these other states where cases are really surging and I'd be even more concerned? Yes. So we're in a place of certainly some concern, but we're not at a point to be shutting things down yet. And if we get to that point, we'll make that hard decision, but it's not where we are now. And I want to make those decisions based on data and based on the risk that we have here in Chicago at this point.
As you know, the city first said that attendees would need to present a negative COVID test from the prior 24 hours. That window has now been expanded to 72 hours. Why the change?
Oh, so, I don't think this was a recent change. I think when we first made this announcement, it was very early on. And obviously, the final decisions are with Lollapalooza. We felt it was most important that people, have that negative test. But really, the main thing we've been pushing is vaccine. And the great majority of folks coming are vaccinated, which is the most important thing. We want to make sure that they've had a test. But for me, the hour window is not as important as making sure that they've done the work of ensuring they have a negative test and then that, they're not having symptoms. So again, I don't see that hour difference as being the big point. The main thing we want folks to do, of course, is get vaccinated. And we have seen lots and lots and lots of people get vaccinated, partly to attend Lolla, because we did a lot of outreach and vaccine events specifically tied to that. So we've tried to use it to build vaccination, I think successfully, among this younger crowd.
Doctor, as you know, Mayor Lightfoot has said that if cases hit 200 new cases a day, that she would consider imposing new restrictions. What kinds of restrictions would those be?
Yeah, so 200 cases per day for us really marks the point where we would move from lower risk into a moderate risk, especially for people who are unvaccinated, right? The risk becomes higher and higher as folks are unvaccinated. So once we get over that 200 mark, which I do expect will happen probably soon, that's really when you might see us start recommending masks in indoor settings, for example. If we get over that 400 case per day mark, which would be the equivalent of the travel advisory that we use around the country, that might be more when we go back to really maybe the mask mandates, for example. So we'll see. We're going to continue to follow the data. In this case, this surge is coming a little bit behind what we're seeing around the country. So we're having an opportunity to learn from some other settings. And importantly, even while we've been seeing cases really increase, we've not seen that major increase in most cases in hospitalizations and in deaths, really different than before the vaccine. So it's not quite as black and white as sometimes people think it is. We'll be watching that data here and then making sure that we're making the recommendations that we need to do to protect the healthcare system and to encourage people to keep getting vaccinated, because that is the most important thing, of course, to protect yourself and those around you.
Doctor, one question that's on a lot of people's minds, parents, grandparents, and so forth, is when will kids under 12 be vaccinated? When might that trigger?
Yeah, so we're waiting for those studies to finish. And it's funny because, on the earlier side of this, we were getting a lot of like, how did this vaccine come to fruition so quickly, within a year? And at this point, I think we've gotten used to that, where people have seen that we use all the same scientific studies. We follow people for long term, and you can't speed up the process. So there are still studies that are happening for kids. We're hearing potentially, this fall is when we may start to see the FDA approve vaccine for school-age kids. It could be later in the fall, maybe even, end of the year. We just don't know at this point. But we know we are starting school without yet the ability to vaccinate children under 12.
Dr. Allison Arwady, thanks again for your insights. We very much appreciate it, as always.
Thank you.
And now, Amanda, we go back to you.
Thanks, Phil. More than 80 active fires are burning across 12 states, with California, Washington, and Oregon hit especially hard. Roughly 1.5 million acres have already burned as firefighters struggle to contain the blazes. The fires may be largely in the west, but they have cast a pall of haze across the country. In fact, earlier today, the National Weather Service issued a warning about poor air quality in Chicago, citing the smoke from the western wildfires. Joining us now to share his insight is Rao Kotamarti. He's the chief scientist and department head of the Atmospheric Science and Climate Research Group at Argonne National Laboratory. Thanks so much for joining us. And, in terms of the fires that we are seeing across much of the western United States as well as in Canada, are these significantly worse than in previous years?
Actually, right now they are not worse than before. Like 2020 was kind of the worst year. So they are ranging about the average. And I think later on in early August, probably they will deviate a little bit more into the extreme.
2020, always the worst year for in so many ways. Why have they, however, they are bad this year as well, on
Yes.
top of last year.
Yeah.
Why is this? Is it a sign of climate change?
So as a caution, it's always not better to look at one incident and say it is climate change, but you have to look at the trend. If you look at the last 10, 15 years, the amount of these forest fires have been increasing steadily, and it is getting worse each year. And it is pretty certain that part of it is contributed by climate change. For this particular one, there is a drought that developed in California, kind of unexpected in the sense that 2019, they came out of a drought. And then it again went into drought early this year. So that was a kind of a reason for California fires and much of the West. And they have been growing quite rapidly over the last 2 months. It's early summer, so it is kind of not very common to have wildfires this early in the season.
So that is a change in terms of the seasonality. Typically, you would have fires occurring perhaps more in the fall, but now we're seeing them more in the summer. Now, you brought up the drought conditions in the West. So can you speak more to that longer fire season brought on by these droughts? And I mean, how long has this drought been going?
So it's about 6 to 8 months now. The thing with the drought is that what happens is when you have a drought and you get a hot and low moisture atmospheric conditions, what it does is that it sucks soil out of the water out of the soil and vegetation, so it becomes more dry. So when you have a high wind, hot temperature and low moisture conditions like we have right now, it essentially is making the vegetation more dry. That kind of makes it all you need right now, and then is just something to light the fire, and something like a fireworks or some campfire. That starts the fire. So this is what is happening right now in much of the West, and it is partly due to climate change in the sense that we never seen these kinds of temperatures in the West. For example, most of the records were broken in the West over the last few weeks, and again another heat dome is developing. So these are not usual conditions in much of the Pacific Northwest, for example. So it's a pretty interesting situation that is being brought in by the climate change.
And I believe that the thought is that this fire in Oregon, the bootleg began perhaps because of a lightning strike. So can't really blame that on anybody, but terrible nonetheless. Now, in terms of how that impacts us, many states, many miles away, we noted that haze across the country. The National Weather Service, again, issuing an air quality alert that warns people with pulmonary and respiratory issues to limit their time outdoors. Is that why we're seeing seemingly smoggy air when we go outside, and how hazardous to our health is it?
So I think last, probably Thursday and Friday, you have seen some of this. So if you look around 4 kilometers in the atmosphere, we have been making some measurements at Argonne, and we can see a pretty thick layer, dense layer of smoke around 4 kilometers and above. So that is, of course, is not harmful to you because it's flowing right across the country. But when it mixes down to the surface, like where we live, essentially, then that's when it becomes a health problem. So you expect conditions like this to develop later in the evening, like around 5, 6. There will be a mix down of some of the pollution, and you would see an increase in the number of particles. So I think we saw last week about 40 micrograms per meter cube of PM2.5, which is twice what we expect in summer in Chicago. So that is, the EPA standard is around 30, I think. 30 micrograms. So we are seeing elevated amounts of particle pollution here, and that does have some health effects.
On top of course, ozone, smog, and the
yes.
regular issues that with air quality that we experience in this region. Now, the bootleg fire started, I think, 2 weeks ago. The fire in California, about a week and a half. How long are these going to continue to smolder?
So smoldering can take place 5-6 months. So there's some of these fires actually smolder for a long time. But the fires themselves, the forecast I've seen is that sometime around middle of August, you'll reach a peak of burned area, according to forecasts. So you can expect these kind of things to happen for the next 3 to 4 weeks at least before they start dying down. At least at the extent we're seeing right now.
Thank you so very much for that explanation. Our appreciation to you, Rao Kotamarti. And now back to Phil for some of today's top business headlines. Phil.
Thanks, Amanda. A merger that would have created the world's largest insurance brokerage falls through. Rush University Medical Center is requiring COVID vaccinations for all workers and volunteers. And McDonald's has a new corporate team on the menu that not everyone might be ordering. Here to go behind the headlines, that is Crane Chicago business editor Ann Dwyer. And let's talk about that proposed merger between Aon and Willis Towers Watson. It was supposed to have been a $30 billion merger. It fell through. What happened?
Well, these are very large companies, Phil, that aren't necessarily headline-making companies, but they're ones that really drive the Chicago economy in many ways. Major employers here. Aon one of the companies involved in this deal was founded here in Chicago. Both Aon and Willis Towers Watson are in the business of helping very large corporate clients to shop around for risk management products. They're not a small mom and pop retail operation by any stretch. Now, what happened, though, what's really changed is D.C. At the time that Aon and Willis Towers Watson first started talking about merging, Donald Trump was in office. Now Joe Biden is president, and his administration is taking a much different stance toward antitrust matters. And I think both companies recognized that by forming what would be the largest insurance brokerage in the world, they would likely undergo some antitrust scrutiny that would probably be painful for both. Now, the collapse of this deal is probably inspiring some sighs of relief at Aon Center, because this merger would have likely led to some major layoffs here in Chicago. So that's the silver lining on this cloud.
Let's move on to our next story, and that is the American Medical Association and other groups are calling for a COVID vaccine mandate for healthcare workers. And this as Rush Medical Center announces that it's requiring all its workers and volunteers to be vaccinated. This push for vaccines has been going on for some time, but what's changed now?
Well, what's changed now is an alarming rise in COVID variants, the Delta strain, as well as now the Lambda strain, which I'm sure you've read about. What was really surprising to me, at least, when we first started researching Rush University's story today, was that only 1 in 4 U.S. hospital workers, Phil, who are in contact with patients on a regular basis nationwide, have received 1 dose of the vaccine as of May. That was the most recent data available. And I think that hospital administrators are now looking at this through a variety of lenses, from the public health lens to the liability lens, and saying to themselves, it's time for us to tell our staff that we need to mitigate this.
And lastly, McDonald's says it has a new team of workers to collect consumer data. Should we be concerned about this next time we're zipping through the drive-through lane?
Well, everything we do nowadays, Phil, with our smartphones or with our credit cards, it seems like it's fodder for marketing and monetization, and McDonald's is no exception. In fact, just now they've dedicated a designated team that's going to be data mining all of your buying habits at McDonald's, with an eye toward pitching more effective marketing ideas and special offers your way. And theoretically, this is also supposed to speed up order delivery, particularly in the drive-thru, which is a critical part of McDonald's business. So that's the good news, I guess. If you're the type of person, though, who's troubled by the notion of big hamburger knowing everything you do, maybe you're not going to McDonald's anyway.
Yes, one doesn't relish the thought of that. And,
oh, no.
We'll see. And thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Phil.
And up next, dance lessons with the Lipizan Stallions. So stay with us.
Don't ever miss Chicago Tonight. Subscribe to our podcast. Get a daily download of our show delivered to your desktop or mobile device. Go to WTTW.com/Chicago Tonight podcast and subscribe.
There's much more ahead on the program, including the anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. But first, there's a farm just north of the city that's working to preserve an art form we'll see at the Tokyo Olympics. Arts correspondent Angel Edow takes us to Temple Farms and the Lipizan Stallions. They're teaching to dance.
We're trying to keep the art form alive. We're trying to keep the training and the history involved into current day. We're one of the few places still doing it.
It's at Temple Farms in Old Mill Creek, Illinois, that a rare horse breed known as the Lipizan Stallion is trained in dressage, or a form of equestrian riding.
They all have different styles, different techniques. We have work-in-hand horses, long-rein horses, horses that are in the quadrille. This horse is the solo horse, so he shows all the movements of the high school in front of the crowd by himself. So we always take some of our most talented horses and develop them into solo horses.
Now, it's usually about 4 years before a Lipizan stallion, like Cookie here, begins their formal equestrian training.
A lot of people don't realize the amount of time that we put into these horses before they're ready to perform. It is a lifelong endeavor for both the riders and the horses.
Now, the relationship is built over a 5 to 6 year period, with trainers working with the horses for about an hour a day. Once they've got their routines down, it's showtime.
In the center, we have Aurelia. She's a 16-year-old mare with very unusual markings.
The show? Weekly dance recitals, of course. It's the newest educational opportunity offered by Temple Farms, where attendees can learn more about the art form.
This breed was established 400 years ago.
Beginning with the youngest of our herd, our foals, we moderate basically what it is about the Lipizzan horse that enables it to do what we call dancing, which is dressage. So we actually show from young horse to intermediate horse to advanced horse what it is that the rider's doing.
Program Director Esther Bonanno narrates these weekly recitals. And while she's not a trainer, Bonanno says it's both the horse's natural ability and curiosity to adapt to this art form that makes her proud to educate people on this historical legacy.
These stallions learn to work with one another, next to one another. They learn to not just move on straight line and circles, but to cross their legs over in really elegant ways. We even do a pirouette in dressage, so that rather than doing a circle on a straight line, they are now doing a circle, carrying themselves on their hind ends. And then what we even do here at Temple Lipizzans, which is not done anywhere else here in the country, is the airs above the ground. And these are former battle maneuvers stylized into an art form where you actually see horses jump up off of their feet and kick in the air.
I love it. Show attendee and former rider Kathy agrees. She says to witness the Lipizzan stallions perform in person is truly a once-in-a-lifetime experience.
They emanate a presence and an energy and a power. And to see the way they listen to their trainers, I don't think that you can ever fully capture classical riding unless you're right here.
For Chicago Tonight, I'm Angel Ito.
If you are interested in learning more about how the Lipizzans dance, classes continue through the beginning of September on select Wednesdays, Saturdays, and Sundays. We have ticket information and more on our website. And now, Amanda, back to you.
Thank you, Phil. Still to come on Chicago Tonight, on the 31st year anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, President Biden introduces protections for people suffering from long-term COVID symptoms. How much of a role does poverty play in the child welfare system, and could direct financial support for families be the answer? And women are the fastest growing incarcerated group in the country. A look at some of the barriers facing these women when they re-enter society. But first, some more of today's top stories. Mayor Lori Lightfoot says she's focused on her first term when asked if she's running again. Here's what she said today about running for re-election.
All the things that are going on in our city, all the challenges that we are facing. And I think that residents have a right to demand my full attention on. My re-election is not a priority for me at this point. It will become something that we talk about as a family later on, but that's not now.
Showtime is giving back to Chicago. The cable network is donating $500,000 to the city's Green Corps Chicago and Chicago Public Art Group. The money will go toward programs on the south and west sides where its hit series, The Chi, is filmed.
We felt it was essential to find a way to give back to the city, and thanks to the mayor and your office, we were able to pull together this program and really thought about giving back to the neighborhoods where our show is shot, where it is produced, the stories that we tell, the incredible stories that we tell.
The Archdiocese of Chicago has a new schools chief. Greg Richmond, a former Chicago Public Schools administrator, will begin leading the Archdiocese's 162 elementary and secondary schools this upcoming school year. Richmond is best known for establishing CPS's charter schools program in 1997. He starts his new position August 16th. More than 3 decades ago, landmark legislation was signed to protect disabled persons from discrimination in areas of employment, transportation, public accommodation, and community living. President Joe Biden, who was one of the co-sponsors of the Americans with Disabilities Act, today, on the 31st anniversary of the ADA, announced new protections for those suffering from long-haul COVID-19 symptoms.
Many Americans who seemingly recover from the virus still face lingering challenges like breathing problems, brain fog, chronic pain, or fatigue. These conditions can sometimes rise to the level of a disability. So we're bringing agencies together to make sure Americans with long COVID who have a disability have access to the rights and resources that are due under the disability law.
Joining us to discuss the executive order in the ADA are Barry Taylor, Vice President for Civil Rights and Systemic Litigation at Equip for Equality. That's the state of Illinois' Disability Protection and Advocacy Agency. And Ashley Eisenmenger, she's Public Relations Coordinator for Access Living, a disability services and support organization. We appreciate both of you joining us. Barry, I would like to start with you. I looked up your bio, so I know that you've been practicing law since the late 80s, early 90s, and therefore, could you summarize the impact of the Americans with Disabilities Act before it took effect in 1990? What was life like for people?
Yes. So before the ADA, in the 1960s, Civil Rights Acts were passed, but did not include disability. And so people with disability did not have federal protections for many, many years. And it wasn't until 1990 that Congress said, yes, disability needs to be part of the civil rights conversation. And so that was really important to elevate disability into the civil rights arena as opposed to a medical issue. And while some employers and some businesses were providing access on a voluntary basis, what the ADA provided was a national standard that employers and transit agencies and government services and private businesses all are held accountable for. And many have moved affirmatively to comply with the ADA, and people with disabilities have so much more access than they had before the ADA. So it's definitely a reason to celebrate, even though we certainly have ways to go.
Is there a quick material example that you could give us, Barry, of a change?
Certainly. Certainly. I think, my first case was when we heard that the Chicago Public Schools was asking every teacher applicant about their disability as a condition for being employed. And the ADA says you can't do that. You have to evaluate the person's ability to do the job before you have any kind of conversation about disability. So people with disabilities were automatically being excluded from employment because people were asking these questions, and the ADA says, no, we want to evaluate you just like everybody else, and then move forward from there.
Despite all of the successes of the ADA, hurdles do remain. So Ashley, Access Living offers services to people with intellectual, psychiatric, physical, and sensory disabilities. What sort of everyday hurdles do some of the clients still face?
Yeah, so the ADA has not been fully realized. I am fortunate to be a member of the ADA generation. So personally, I've never not known the protections that the ADA affords me. It's been in effect my entire life. We see problems and issues arise for folks that we serve in healthcare inequities, racial inequities, housing disparities. The work is not done for us.
And Ashley, to that end, as somebody that is a member of the ADA generation, are there any specific improvements or protections that you would recommend be added?
I think when we look at the impacts, especially now of the COVID-19 pandemic and how our entire workforce and education sectors have had to shift to primarily relying on digital means of communication, we need to look at two things: solving the digital divide and addressing the inequities within access to technology for people with disabilities, but we also need to make sure that our digital environments are accessible. When we look at the ADA as it stands, it does a fairly good job of recognizing the need to make the built environment, the physical environment, accessible. But when the ADA was signed into law in 1990, the internet isn't what it was now. And so we have work to do in regards to making the internet a more accessible place.
I believe I noticed on the Equip for Equality website, for example, there is language, font size, contrast, those sorts of things, so that individuals that have particular disabilities would be able to utilize a website, deposit money from a check into their bank account, something along those lines. And so, and further, let's move on to you, Barry, actually, because Ashley, you brought up the COVID symptoms. And of course, we have today President Biden discussing protections for people that are suffering from these long COVID symptoms that render them disabled, but that those protections only come after an evaluation. So what sort of threshold do you envision for qualifying for that disabled status?
Sure. I mean, I think this is a great example of how the ADA has evolved as society has evolved. So we really didn't have emergency protections and preparedness before the ADA. And since then, we've had 9/11, we've had Katrina, we now have COVID. And the ADA is able to address those issues. And so the definition of disability under the ADA is you have to have a physical and mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. And President Biden, in the guidance that the Department of Justice and Health and Human Services put out today, says that long COVID, long haulers, that is a physical impairment. And what you would need to show is that you have some sort of substantial limitation in a major life activity. So the example that President Biden mentioned, somebody who has lung damage, that's the physical impairment. And you would need to show some sort of major life activity is substantially limited, like the ability to breathe. And if that's the case, if you have a disability, then all the protections kick in. So the accommodations that you're entitled to under the ADA would kick in. So maybe somebody who has that type of issue might need to telework so that they're not around other folks that might make them more susceptible to additional symptoms. And so that's what's really important, is that while there is no per se disability, what this guidance says is that generally people with long haul COVID are going to have protections under the ADA that'll kick in. And it's really important for all the entities, both people with disabilities and those who are covered, to know about this development.
Thank you so very much for that explanation, Barry Taylor, also Ashley Eisenmenger.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And now to Phil Ponce for a conversation on child welfare as part of our monthly Firsthand Poverty series. Phil.
Thanks, Amanda. Families living in poverty are more likely to be involved with the child welfare system. And in more than 60% of cases nationwide, authorities find children being neglected, not abused. That's according to a recent brief from Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago that argues direct financial support for families would result in fewer children being maltreated. Tonight, as part of our Firsthand Living in Poverty series, we look at the barriers facing families who need financial assistance. And joining us to hear more about that report is Dana Weiner. She's a senior policy fellow at Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago, and she is the lead author of the report. Many thanks for joining us. First of all, what was your main finding about families and poverties and involvement in the child welfare system?
Yeah, so hi, Phil. Thanks for having me. So what we were primarily focused on was conveying the complexity and the multi-determined nature of families' involvement in child welfare systems that really requires a coordinated response from the entire human service sector. What we have right now is a system where oftentimes teachers place child maltreatment reports to the child abuse reporting hotline. Their teachers are responsible for the largest proportion of those reports at around 20%. But the majority of what teachers report is never substantiated as child maltreatment, and oftentimes are things secondary to poverty. So we think there need to be other pathways for families to receive those supports.
And one of the points you make is that that you assert is that even modest economic support for families can stabilize families so that these kinds of issues don't arise. What kind of economic support are you talking about?
Well, so the research suggests that things like housing and childcare subsidies, in addition to other benefits, provide families with the opportunity to stabilize and promote safety and well-being of the children in their care. I think we're at a key juncture now because we're going to be able to observe the impact of direct cash payments to families more and more. And many researchers are discussing what the best way is to evaluate those direct supports that are currently being dispersed as part of the child tax credit.
And what kind of, in terms of monetary figures, what amount is being discussed?
You know, we've seen that even modest financial supports of a few $100s can really help families to address some of the basic concrete needs that are required in order to stabilize.
And spell out for us how this even modest support in your, according to your report, would reduce the number of maltreatment reports. How does that work?
So one of the things that we observed as and part of this was a byproduct of the pandemic. So as the pandemic began, many people were concerned because child abuse reporting rates plummeted because most of those are being called in by teachers and kids weren't seeing teachers. And so in the process of investigating whether there was cause for concern that teachers weren't reporting child maltreatment, we were able to observe some interesting patterns in the data. One of which I already mentioned, that a very small proportion of teacher reports are ever substantiated as abuse or neglect. But in the process, we also examined the community level correlates, the other things that seem to go along with changes in the rate of child maltreatment, and unemployment was the single biggest predictor of fluctuations in the rate of child abuse reporting. So there are a number of different theories about why that is, about how economic hardship and economic risk contributes to risk to child safety. Some of that has to do with parental stress, but a lot of it has to do with the systems that are set up to detect problems among families really are only left with a single option, which is a child protection services hotline call, as opposed to a network of community-based supports, a safety net, so to speak, that families could access to get help.
So just to make sure I understand what you're saying, that financial stresses on families can lead to the kind of stress that causes parents to mistreat their kids. Is that what you're saying?
No, not necessarily that. No, what I'm saying is that economic hardship can create circumstances like housing instability or possibly inadequate childcare that then can lead those families to come to the attention of child welfare systems, even though their needs would be better met by a different intervention and not a child protective services investigation.
Okay, you alluded to this, but you assert that mandatory reporting laws cause an increased surveillance on families. Expand on that.
Yeah, so mandated reporting laws are in effect across the country, but they vary, and there's quite a bit of discretion involved in mandated reporting. But as I mentioned, teachers being one of the biggest sources of those reports, often report a variety of concerns, many of which would be better addressed by another system. A child welfare investigation initiates a punitive and expensive and intrusive process. What we've seen in the research is that alternative pathways, things like differential or alternative response, provide an opportunity to give families some of those economic supports, but also other types of supports without having a child protection investigation when there is likely to be no substantiated maltreatment.
Dana Weiner, thank you so much for your insights. We very much appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
And up next, Brandes Friedman and a look at a growing population, women in prison. That's a conversation that first aired on Sunday's Chicago Tonight Black Voices. But first, a look at the weather.
More women are dying in U.S. jails. In 2000, women accounted for about 10% of jail deaths. In 2018, that number grew to 16%. And black women are overrepresented in the nation's jails and prisons. And it was 6 years ago that Chicago area native Sandra Bland was found hanged in her Texas jail cell after a traffic stop led to her arrest. Joining us to talk about what women, particularly women of color, face in the carceral system are Nika Jones-Tapia, a psychologist and the managing director of Justice Initiatives for Chicago Beyond. She also served as warden for Cook County Jail between 2015 and 2018. Willette Benford, decarceration organizer at Live Free Illinois. She was incarcerated for over 2 decades. And Celia Colon, founder of Giving Others Dreams. She is also formerly incarcerated. And thanks to all of you for joining us to discuss this issue. Nika Jones-Tapia, let's start with you, please. Welcome back to Chicago Tonight. What factors contribute to the increasing mortality rate of incarcerated women?
First, I'd like to just paint the landscape of what we're talking about here. I think it's important for people to know that even though the number of women who are incarcerated is relatively small compared to men, the rate of incarceration for women has increased almost 700% in the last 40 years. And unfortunately, policies and procedures in these correctional systems have not increased with that rate. Women are often overlooked when we talk about programs and treatment and access to health care within these systems because the number is relatively small compared to men. And then correctional systems as a whole are catastrophically dark places. You know, they disconnect people from everything that they know and love. They drain hope out of a person's life. They're dark, and people, especially women, and especially Black women and women of color, are overly exposed to trauma within these systems, like sexual violence and physical violence.
Willette, what challenges do women, and particularly Black women, what do they face in prison and jail?
Well, Black women often face, the racism that is still going on outside. Racism is just as prevalent inside as it is outside. Black women are more likely to be overlooked and given low-level jobs like cleaning toilets as opposed to working in the offices or the administrative buildings inside. Being inside, I had to fight for women of color to get a job that afforded them more money, days off their sentence, and also a 2-man cell, which was often given to white women. They had only hired 2 women of color in 5 years before I wrote a 6-page grievance on racism and discrimination. After that grievance, they began to hire women of color at a rapid pace.
So obviously, and it sounds like there's a lot that goes on there. So 80% of women in prison are mothers. More than 60% are mothers to children under the age of 18. This is according to the Sentencing Project as well as the Prison Policy Initiative. Celia, how does incarceration impact the family unit and a person's experience with the criminal legal system?
One of the most horrific things that has happened to our nation. There's plenty of data that shows time and time again that incarceration does not make communities any safer. It doesn't stop the violence. If anything, it creates more violence and more chaos because there's more people that are catastrophically harmed, and it creates generational harms, generational barriers. There's children, innocent children across this nation that are paying for debts that they do not owe. There's children that are being blocked. There's parents, mothers that are being blocked from their children's lives. We're not allowed somebody with a record to be a parent. And what I mean by that, inside the school systems, if you have a record, you cannot volunteer, you cannot chaperone, you cannot do anything but pick up a report card. So therefore, that's creating the prison to pipeline. That's creating a disconnect between the child and the parent. And there's a lot of that that's going on. There's jobs that you can't get if you are tied to someone who has a record. That's even working in the police work, working for the FBI, a lot of schools. I am someone who got my record sealed. I did what America said to do. I've been home for over 21 years, been giving back to my community, served the most, served people that are harmed the most, had my record sealed, but yet I still don't have all my civil rights back. I still can't run for office. I still can't work at school. There's a lot of things that I still cannot do, and that's what we're here to talk about, ending generational harm, really looking at the impact of what this does to children. Our future leaders are being destroyed before even given a chance.
And
now,
Miranda,
we mentioned this.
Add that,
Go ahead,
we know that there's an overwhelming number of people who are incarcerated who are parents, men and women. But what makes the experience of women unique is that most of them are the sole caregivers for their children. One of the first women that I encountered at Cook County Jail was a mother who was charged with murder of her partner. She was experiencing domestic violence, which is the case for a lot of women that we don't talk about. And she was separated from her children. She was, put in the squad car and driven away for a week. She didn't know where her children were and if they were safe. Like, I just can't imagine that as a mother being my experience and not knowing whether or not my children are safe. And so I think the sole caregiving of mothers who are incarcerated has to be elevated when we think about the impact of incarceration.
So, and you just mentioned this a minute ago as well, Nika, the number of incarcerated women has been rising for decades. In 1980, about 26,000 women were incarcerated, and in 2019, more than 222,000 were. Now, that's an increase, as you just said, of more than 700%. Willette, why is that? Are there problems that women face that are unique to them, and what are some of the barriers that they face when re-entering?
Well, Brandis, Black women are often policed differently. That's why they make up 14% of the Illinois adult population, but over a third of everyone that's incarcerated. And we know that in 1980, the war on drugs, and then the 92 crime bill, really said that it was a war on drugs, but it was really a war on Black communities. And, Black communities were decimated by police coming in, kicking in doors, arresting women, and saying, the conspiracy law, the federal conspiracy law, where even if your man sold drugs and you didn't even know about it, they wanted to link you in with that. So they really just destroyed Black families back then. And many women are sitting in prison today with natural life sentences on drug charges that they acquired back when we know that there was such a disparity in the crack cocaine law and the powder cocaine law, because white people use powder more, so they got lesser sentences. And then crack cocaine was normally found in low-income, poverty-stricken communities. And really, poverty has been criminalized. If a Black woman has a substance abuse problem, she's criminalized and sent to prison for a couple of bags of drugs, whereas our white counterpart is sent to a rehab so that she can get her life together and return home to her children. So poverty and systemic racism is the underlying issue for the expansion of the prison population in Illinois and across this nation.
And Celia Colon, your organization, you work to support women mostly on the South and the West sides when they leave prison. What resources are necessary for them when they get home?
Just being incarcerated has multiple layers of harm, so it requires multiple layer solution. I am just one of many vessels and many organizations that are out here doing the work, and I would like to uplift some of them Black and brown organizations like Chicago Beyond, Fully Free, Kids Off the Block, Activists, Girls Like Me, Rage. There's a lot of us, my group, God, Giving Others Dreams, that are out here on the front lines doing the work. And what we do is we support people, our people, unapologetically. We show up with no judgment, no disparities, just giving them resources and tools and being their mentors and their guides, but also giving them all the support that they need for their first month home, meaning we support the woman and her family, because when somebody's incarcerated, the whole family's impacted. The whole family is hurting. And right now in the state of Illinois, there's 7 neighborhoods that 27,000 people that are released every year from IDOC come home to. And they are on the west and the south side. And the economics in our communities haven't changed. The opportunities in these communities haven't changed. The lack of resources in these communities haven't changed. So it's up to us to show up for each other and to bring the resources. So we serve the women with what's called a We Win Welcome Home package, because when we invest in women, we win as a community, as a society, and we try to give them all the tools that they need, meaning we do a barrier assessment with them over the phone, find out what band-aids they need to do so that they don't have a technicality and go back, and that's how a lot of people are forced back. And we bring them connections to them, direct resources, because I have community partners, but we also dress them with, interview clothes and all the hygiene products.
And getting them off on the right foot,
yes.
right, to take those next steps. We win is actually where we're going to have to leave it. My thanks to all of you for joining us, Nika Jones-Tapia, Celia Colon, and Willette Binford.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Back to wrap things up right after this.
And that's our show for this Monday night. Don't forget to stay connected with us by signing up for our daily briefing. And you can get Chicago Tonight streamed on Facebook, YouTube, and our website, WTTW.com/news.
You can also get the show via podcast and the PBS video app. And please join us tomorrow night live at 7. A breakthrough discovery led by a University of Chicago team could massively boost global crop production.
And Chicago's colorful role in the early development of the comic strip. And in just a few minutes, be sure to join our virtual community conversation. Arts correspondent Angel Ito will talk with independent artists and community leaders about the future of Chicago's art scene. That event starts at 8 p.m. Visit WTTW.com/events to RSVP. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Phil Ponce.
And I'm Amanda Vinicky. Thank you for watching. Stay healthy and safe. Good night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a Chicago personal injury and wrongful death firm that supports free educational initiatives in the legal profession.